My brother told his business partner something at our family breakfast table 18 years ago that he thought no one else heard. He said his own 6-year-old son was worthless, that the boy would never amount to anything. He leaned across the orange juice and the scrambled eggs, and he said it like it was just a fact, the way you'd mention the weather. What my brother didn't know, what none of us knew, was that his little boy was standing in the kitchen doorway, still in his pajamas, and he heard every single word. I have been called a lot of things since the morning that truth finally came out. Dramatic, vindictive, someone who should have stayed out of it. But nobody, not one person in that family, has ever called me wrong about what I witnessed. And what I witnessed changed the course of that child's life in ways my brother still hasn't fully processed. Even now, even after standing in a conference room and watching his son walk onto a stage in front of cameras and investors and a news anchor who asked him to tell the world about his journey. Let me tell you how we got here. My name is Nora Scott, and I am 41 years old. My brother's name is Dale Mercer. We grew up in the same house in Raleigh, North Carolina, the kind of house where ambition was tolerated in men and quietly discouraged in women, where success was something the men at the table announced and the women at the table applauded. Dale was 7 years older than me, which meant by the time I was forming real memories of family life, he was already being treated like the heir apparent to something, though honestly, at the time, none of us could have told you what. Our father ran a small logistics consulting business. Nothing flashy. Enough to keep us comfortable, enough to keep Dale believing that business was his birthright, and that everyone around him existed to support that belief. I loved my brother when we were young. I want to be honest about that. He wasn't cruel as a child. He was just shaped by a father who told him that his instincts were always right and by a mother who never once disagreed with that assessment out loud. I left Raleigh at 22 with a computer science degree and a job offer from a mid-sized software firm in Charlotte. My mother told me that was a sensible choice. Stable. That word, stable, was the ceiling she had decided was appropriate for me. Not ambitious. Not visionary, stable. I smiled and hugged her and drove to Charlotte, and the first thing I did when I got to my new apartment was open my laptop and map out a 5-year plan that had nothing stable about it. Dale, by that point, had married a woman named Celeste Yun, a corporate attorney with a dry sense of humor and an eye for detail that I genuinely admired. Their son, my nephew, was born the following year. They named him Brendan. Brendan Mercer, 6 pounds and 9 ounces, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn jaw, and from the moment I held him I felt something I can only describe as protective in a way I hadn't anticipated. He was just a baby. But there was something about the way Dale held him, like an achievement, like a trophy he'd already decided had a particular purpose, that made me hold my breath a little. I visited Raleigh 4 or 5 times a year in those early years. I was building something in Charlotte, slowly, carefully, the way you build anything that's meant to last, and I was not yet in a position to explain what it was to people who would have immediately tried to redirect it. So I kept my visits cheerful and my updates vague. I was doing well at work. I was learning a lot. I was saving money. These were all true. None of them were the whole picture. The first time Dale dismissed me in a way that I can point to and say, that was the moment I understood what I was dealing with. I was 26 years old. We were at Sunday dinner at our parents' house, and I mentioned that I was thinking about leaving the software firm to pursue something independent. I didn't give details. I just said I was considering a transition. Dale set down his fork with the particular precision of a man preparing to deliver wisdom. Nora. He said my name the way a doctor says it before bad news. Independent consulting in tech is a young man's game. The market's oversaturated. You've got a good thing where you are. Don't blow it chasing something that isn't realistic for your situation. My situation. I let that sit for a moment. I was 26 years old, I had no debt, I had 11 months of expenses saved, and I had already had 2 informal conversations with potential clients who were interested in what I could offer on my own. My situation was, by any objective measure, better positioned for risk than his had been when he launched his first venture. But I didn't say that. I nodded thoughtfully and passed the bread basket, and that evening I went home and sent a formal follow-up email to one of those potential clients confirming our meeting for the following Tuesday. That was the first thing I understood about how to survive in that family. Silence is not the same as agreement, and patience is not the same as weakness. I was not going to win an argument at that table. but I was going to build something at that table's expense, by which I mean with every condescending remark as fuel. Brendan was 3 that year, old enough to toddle around underfoot during Sunday dinners, old enough to climb into my lap and demand that I read him picture books while the adults talked. I liked being the one he came to. Celeste noticed, I think. She had a way of watching things quietly that reminded me a little of myself. The second incident I can point to happened when Brendan was about 4. I had, by this point, left the software firm and launched a boutique technology consulting practice. My first year on my own, I cleared just over $230,000 in revenue. Not profit revenue, but even the profit margin was something I had not expected to hit that quickly, and I was cautious about it, aware that one good year does not a business make. I did not mention any of this to my family. My mother still thought I was freelancing. Dale thought I was struggling. I let them think what they wanted to think because correcting them required energy I preferred to spend elsewhere. At a 4th of July gathering that summer, Dale's business partner at the time, a man named Frank Ose, who seemed genuinely decent and slightly uncomfortable at family events, made a polite inquiry about what I was doing professionally. Before I could answer, Dale cut in with the smooth confidence of a man who believes he is being helpful. "She's doing some consulting," he said. "Tech stuff. It's a tough market right now, honestly. Nora's resourceful, though. She'll figure something out." He smiled at me when he said it. Affectionate, almost. Completely certain he was right. Frank looked at me with the polite neutrality of someone who doesn't know what to do with information he's just received. I smiled back at my brother with equal affection. "Thanks, Dale," I said, and then I turned to Frank and asked him a question about his work, because there was genuinely no upside to correcting Dale in front of a guest. But I remember driving home that night thinking, he does not see me at all. He is looking directly at me and seeing someone he invented. If you have ever been counted out by someone who should have known better, someone who had every opportunity to pay attention but chose their assumptions instead, you know exactly what that particular silence feels like. It's not humiliating, not really. It's clarifying. Every time Dale declined to see me accurately, I became a little more certain that when the moment came, the gap between his perception and reality would be spectacular. Brendan was 6 years old on the morning in question. Dale and Celeste had recently formalized a business partnership with a man named Victor Huang, a venture capital consultant who was helping Dale restructure his logistics firm for a potential acquisition. Victor came to Sunday brunch at our parents' house that January morning because Dale had been blurring the line between business and family for years, treating family gatherings as extension offices where deals could be softened by the warmth of a home-cooked meal. I was there. My mother made eggs and biscuits and the kind of coffee that required a second cup before anyone was fully functional. Brendan was still in his pajamas when the adults arrived, and I remember watching him move between the dining room and the kitchen with the particular purposefulness of a 6-year-old who has been told to stay out of the way, but hasn't quite committed to the instruction. I was standing near the window with my coffee when I heard Dale say it. He was at the far end of the table with Victor, their voices low in the way men's voices get when they're talking business and don't want to be interrupted. I wasn't trying to listen, but the house was old and the acoustics were strange, and some sound carried in ways that other sound didn't. "My son," Dale said, with a particular flatness. "Honestly, Victor, worthless. Absolutely no drive, no focus. He's never going to amount to anything. I don't know where he came from." I felt something move through me that I can only describe as cold, not metaphorically. A literal temperature drop in my chest, like ice water poured too fast. Victor made a sound, a non-committal sound, the kind men make when they don't know whether to agree or redirect. I turned my head toward the kitchen doorway, and there was Brendan, standing very still in his dinosaur pajamas, holding a biscuit he'd stolen from the basket on the counter, looking at his father with an expression I had never seen on a 6-year-old's face before and have not seen since. It was not crying. It was not anger. It was something more like recalibration. Like a small, serious mind absorbing a piece of information and filing it somewhere permanent. Nobody else saw him. My mother was in the kitchen. Celeste was in the bathroom. I was the only one in the sightline of that doorway. Brendan caught my eye for 1 second. I don't know what my face did. I hope it was steady. Then he walked back into the kitchen with his biscuit, and a few minutes later I heard the back door open and close as he went into the yard. I didn't say anything at the table. Not that morning, not that year, but I made a decision in the space of that 1 second of eye contact with a 6-year-old boy in dinosaur pajamas. I made a decision that I kept to myself, and I built it quietly, and I built it carefully, and 18 years later it was still standing. I want to be clear about something. Celeste did not know what Dale had said that morning. I am certain of this. I watched her come back to the table, pour herself more coffee, and tuck her hand briefly into Dale's arm in the absent, habitual way of someone who has been married long enough that affection becomes its own kind of muscle memory. She did not know. And because she did not know, the question of what to do with what I had heard became more complicated than it might otherwise have been. I thought about telling her. I thought about it for several weeks, actually. I ran the conversation in my head, probably 30 or 40 times. But every version of that conversation ended the same way. With Celeste in an impossible position, confronting her husband about something he'd said to his business partner in what he believed was private. Trying to undo damage that had already embedded itself in a 6-year-old's nervous system. With no guarantee that Dale would do anything other than minimize it, and with every likelihood that it would create a fracture in their marriage that Brendan, ironically, would be the one to live inside. So I chose differently. I chose to watch, and I chose to be the counterweight. I started spending more deliberate time with Brendan. Not in a way anyone noticed or remarked on. I was his aunt. It was natural that I'd be present. But I was intentional about it in a way I hadn't been before. When he was 7, I started asking him real questions about what he was interested in. Not what do you want to be when you grow up? I hate that question. It puts children under professional pressure before they've had a chance to just be curious. But questions like, what did you figure out this week? And what are you trying to understand right now? The answers surprised me consistently. When Brendan was 7, he was trying to understand why his grandfather's old radio picked up some stations more clearly at night. When he was 8, he had taken apart a broken alarm clock and was attempting to put it back together from memory, using a diagram he'd drawn himself on graph paper. When he was 9, he asked me what a server was and whether it was different from a computer you could hold. I answered every question carefully and completely, the way I wish someone had answered mine when I was 9. And I watched a boy who had been told he was worthless build, quietly and without any encouragement from his father, a mind that was going to do something significant with the world. Dale, during these years, remained consistent. He was not openly cruel to Brendan. I want to be accurate about this. He was not a monster in the straightforward sense. He was more the kind of father who communicates disappointment through absence, through the slightly deflated exhale when his son chose books over basketball, through the way he talked about Brendan's interests to other people as though they were charming eccentricities rather than genuine aptitudes. He's into computers, Dale would say, with a faint smile that meant he had already decided computers were not a real career. He's always taking things apart. He'll grow out of it. I did not grow out of it. I remember thinking the first time I heard Dale say that. I took things apart too. I still do. My consulting practice continued to grow through Brendan's childhood in ways that I kept almost entirely separate from my family life. By the time he was 10, I had a staff of 4 and a client roster that included 2 mid-sized regional banks, a healthcare network that was trying to modernize its patient data systems, and a logistics firm, not Dale's, a different one, that had become my largest retainer relationship. I had moved from Charlotte to a house I owned in a quiet neighborhood near Lake Norman, about 40 minutes from Raleigh, close enough that Sunday dinners were possible, far enough that they were optional. The woman who managed my finances, a forensic accountant named Ingrid Bautista, had been with me since year 3 of the practice. She was methodical and slightly terrifying in the best possible way, and she had, by the time Brendan turned 10, helped me establish a college fund in his name through a custodial account that I funded quietly and consistently from the time he was 7 years old. No one in my family knew it existed. Dale didn't know. Celeste didn't know. My mother didn't know. The account grew without announcement, compounding on its own schedule, funded by a percentage of every retainer payment I received, tended by Ingrid the way a gardener tends something that isn't ready to be seen yet. I did this because I had watched a 6-year-old file away the information that he was worthless, and I had decided, unilaterally, that I was going to make sure the world offered him a different piece of information when the time came. In the fall that Brendan turned 11, I had what I would describe as the first genuinely uncomfortable close call of this entire quiet project. Dale had started talking more openly about Brendan's future, by which I mean he had started making pronouncements about it at family gatherings with the confidence of a man who believes his announcements are the same thing as reality. "He'll come into the firm," Dale said one Sunday in October, without being asked. Brendan was across the room, doing homework on the living room floor, close enough to hear but apparently absorbed in his work. "Take a few years off after high school, learn the business from the ground up. That's what I did. That's what works." I looked at Brendan. He didn't look up from his homework, but I saw his pencil slow down. "Does Brendan know about this plan?" I asked, as neutrally as I could. Dale looked at me with the particular expression he reserved for questions he found naive. "He's 11, Nora." "Right," I said. "Besides," Dale continued, he paused, searching. "He doesn't have the independent drive for something technical. He needs structure. The firm gives him that." I glanced over at Brendan again. He had started writing again, but something in the set of his shoulders had changed. A tightening, almost imperceptible. That evening, when Brendan was helping me carry dishes to the kitchen, because he'd appointed himself my kitchen assistant at some point around age 8 and had never fully resigned from the position, I asked him quietly, while the water was running, "What do you actually want to do when you're grown up? Not what anyone expects. What do you want?" He thought about it seriously, the way he always thought about serious questions. Then he said, "I want to build things that other people can't figure out how to break." I turned off the faucet and looked at him. "Software? Maybe, or systems, like networks, the way things talk to each other." He handed me a plate to dry. "Is that a real job?" "Brendan," I said, "that is one of the most real jobs there is right now." He absorbed this with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has just had a suspicion confirmed. Then he handed me another plate and we didn't talk about it again, but something had been said that didn't need to be revisited. It was in the record. He knew I knew, and he knew I thought it was real. When Brendan was 12, Dale's logistics firm went through a significant restructuring. Victor Huang was no longer in the picture. They'd parted ways over a disagreement about the direction of the acquisition, and Dale had brought in a new financial consultant named Raj Pillai, who was younger and considerably more aggressive about growth targets. The restructuring meant belt-tightening across the board, and one of the first places Dale tightened was at home. I heard about this from my mother, who mentioned it in the careful, slightly edited way she had of delivering information she thought I needed without fully characterizing it as bad news. "Dale's making some adjustments," she said one afternoon on the phone. "Things might be a little lean for a while." I called Ingrid that evening. "The college fund," I said. "I want to increase the monthly contribution." Ingrid didn't ask me to explain. She just said, "How much?" I told her. She was quiet for a moment. "Nora, that's aggressive." "I know. The returns are already, I know," I said. "Do it anyway." She did it. The second close call came when Brendan was 13 and Dale made an offhand comment at a family dinner that nearly landed directly on the truth of what I'd been building. He had been in a good mood that evening, the restructuring had stabilized, Raj's targets were being met, and Dale was expansive the way he got when his professional confidence was high. "You should think about investing in something stable," he said to me, out of nowhere. "Real estate, something tangible. You're not going to be able to sustain a boutique operation forever, you know. At some point, the market consolidates and the small operators get squeezed out." "I've been thinking about diversifying," I said truthfully. He nodded, satisfied. "Smart. Talk to Raj, actually." "He'd know someone?" "I have a financial advisor already," I said. "Ingrid, she's been helping me look at options." "What kind of options?" "Diversified portfolio, some property." Both of these were true. Ingrid and I had, that year, purchased a rental property in Charlotte, a 2-unit building on a corner lot, listed at $420,000, which I'd bought at a slight discount off-market through a contact of Ingrid's. The rental income was steady, the value had already appreciated in the 14 months since purchase, and it was the kind of asset my brother would have been genuinely impressed by if he'd known about it. But he didn't, and I had no intention of telling him. "Good," Dale said. He reached over and patted my hand the way he'd been doing since I was 10 years old. "Good for you, Nora." "Thanks, Dale." I smiled at him. Across the table, Celeste caught my eye very briefly. She had a way, sometimes, of looking at me that felt like it contained more information than either of us was saying out loud. I never fully decoded it. But in that moment, I had the distinct sense that she was watching me absorb my brother's condescension and making some internal note about the quality of my patience. "Brendan," at 13, had saved up enough from birthday money and occasional lawn work for the neighbors to buy himself a used laptop. Dale had offered to replace it with a newer model and Brendan had said no. He wanted to figure out how to fix the used one himself. Dale had relayed this to me with the slight bewilderment of a man who cannot understand why someone would choose difficulty when ease is available. "I don't know what to do with him sometimes," Dale said. "You don't need to do anything with him," I said, more evenly than I felt. "He's figuring it out." "He's going to be behind his peers," Dale said, and I remember the specific combination of frustration and resignation in his voice, the voice of a man who has already decided the outcome and is merely cataloging the evidence. "These kids in private school have access to equipment Brendan won't touch until college." I did not say, "Brendan is going to know those systems at a molecular level because he built his understanding from the ground up, and that is worth more than access to new equipment." I did not say it because I had learned, by this point, the complete uselessness of trying to change my brother's mind about his son in real-time conversation. Instead, I called Ingrid the next morning. "The college fund," I said. "What's the current balance?" she told me. The number was, by that point, genuinely substantial, the kind of number that represented not just education but options, the kind of number that meant Brendan could go anywhere, study anything, and not be beholden to his father's blueprint for a single day of it. "Good," I said. "But growing, Nora," Ingrid's voice had the particular quality she used when she was about to say something professional that was also personal. "You understand that when this child is old enough, the account becomes his and the trustee role transfers to him. Whatever relationship you have with his family at that point, it doesn't change what's in the account." "I know," I said, "just making sure you understand the architecture." "Ingrid," I said, "I have understood the architecture for 7 years. That's why it's still standing." She made a small sound that might have been approval. "Fair enough. I'll send you the quarterly statement." The statement arrived 2 days later, and I went through it carefully at my kitchen table with a second cup of coffee and the particular quiet satisfaction of someone who has been building something for a long time and can see, in the numbers on a page, that it is real. The Charlotte property was appreciating. The fund was compounding. The practice was generating enough that I had, the previous month, brought on a 5th staff member, a young woman named Sujin Park, fresh out of graduate school, who had an eye for systems architecture that reminded me uncomfortably of myself at that age. I had also, 3 months prior, had a first consultation with an attorney named Leonard Chavez, a family and estate lawyer who had been recommended to me by a judge I'd worked with on a data compliance project for the county court system. I'd called Leonard's office on a Tuesday afternoon in March 8th, to be specific, and met with him the following week at his office on Tryon Street, a corner office with a view of the city that suggested a man who had been at this long enough to stop being impressed by the view. I told Leonard a version of the situation, enough to establish what I was trying to protect, without more detail than was necessary. He had listened with the particular quality of attention that good lawyers have, the kind that makes you feel like every word is being filed accurately. "The account structure is solid," he said when I finished. "The custodial arrangement is clean, but I'd recommend we document the intent separately, a letter of instruction that sits alongside the account records and establishes the purpose and conditions clearly." "What kind of conditions?" "That's up to you." He set down his pen. "What do you want to happen if the situation with the family changes?" I thought about a 6-year-old in dinosaur pajamas, standing in a doorway, holding a stolen biscuit and recalibrating his understanding of what his father thought of him. "Nothing changes," I said. "Whatever happens with the family, the account exists for Brendan. That's the only condition." Leonard wrote something on his notepad. "Simple and clean," he said. "I can work with that." By the time Brendan turned 15, the question of his future had become a recurring tension at family gatherings. Dale had stopped being vaguely dismissive and had become specifically directive. He wanted Brendan to shadow him at the firm on weekends, wanted him to start learning the operational side of logistics, wanted to begin the succession architecture he'd apparently been designing in his head since Brendan was born. Brendan, to his considerable credit, had been managing this with a grace that I found both admirable and slightly heartbreaking, the grace of someone who has learned to defer without surrendering. I watched him navigate it at Sunday dinners and occasional holiday gatherings, and what I saw was a young man who had developed the same quality I'd learned to cultivate: the ability to hold 2 things in his head at once, the world as the people around him described it and the world as it actually was. He was patient. He was specific in his communication. He asked questions that contained, folded inside them, the answer he already knew. He was, by 15, better at it than I had been at 25. One afternoon, when he was 15 and had come to spend a Saturday at my house, ostensibly to help me clear out a storage room, actually to sit at my kitchen table and work on a personal coding project he'd been developing in secret for 8 months, I asked him quietly whether he knew what he wanted to do for school. He looked up from his laptop. Then he told me the name of a university, a specific program. A faculty member he'd been following online. The specificity of it, the depth of research it represented, made me put down my coffee cup and look at him properly. "Does your dad know you want this?" "No." He went back to his screen. "Are you going to tell him?" A pause. "Eventually, when I can't avoid it anymore." He kept typing. "Is the fund going to be enough for somewhere like that?" I had not told him about the fund, not directly. He had apparently deduced it. Or perhaps I had said something, once, that had been heard and filed away, by a child who had learned very young to listen carefully to what the adults around him said when they thought he wasn't paying attention. "Yes," I said. "It's going to be more than enough." He nodded once, with the focused composure of someone crossing an item off an internal list. Then he went back to his code. I sat there for a moment looking at him. This 15-year-old with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and his own particular quality of mind that belonged to nobody but himself. And I thought about a breakfast table in January, 18 years from that future moment, and about how the things people say when they think no one is listening have a way of outlasting them in ways they never anticipate. Dale had not known his son was in the doorway. He had said what he believed, in what he believed was private, and the words had landed somewhere they were never supposed to land, and they had not destroyed the boy who caught them. They had, in a way I'm still not entirely able to articulate, made him into someone who was going to prove them wrong with a specificity that would have been almost surgical if it hadn't been so completely unintentional. Brendan had not spent 18 years trying to disprove his father. He had spent 18 years becoming himself, and becoming himself had turned out, quietly, inexorably, to be the most thorough rebuttal imaginable. I didn't know the full scope of what was coming, not yet, not when he was 15 and sitting at my kitchen table. But I had enough of the picture to understand the shape of it. And I had built enough, quietly and carefully, to make sure that when the moment came, the infrastructure was solid enough to hold whatever weight it needed to carry. Brendan turned his laptop toward me briefly to show me something he'd built, a small network visualization tool, clean and elegant, the kind of thing that looked simple until you understood what it was actually tracking, and then he turned it back and kept working. Outside, the lake was flat and silver in the afternoon light, and everything I had built over the previous 9 years was sitting quietly in accounts and documents and a corner office on Tryon Street, waiting for a moment that wasn't here yet, but was getting closer with every Sunday dinner. Every condescending pat on the hand, every time my brother looked at his remarkable son and saw nothing but his own disappointment reflected back. I had exactly 3 years to make sure everything was in place. And I had not yet met the version of Dale that would make me understand I was going to need every single day of it. The 3 years between Brendan at 15 and Brendan at 18 moved the way important years always do, faster than you expect while you're inside them, and then startlingly compressed in memory. I watched him grow into himself with the quiet certainty of someone who had made a private bet and could see the odds moving in their favor. He fixed the laptop. Then he built a better one from salvaged parts. Then he started tutoring other kids at school in network fundamentals for $20 an hour, cash, which he deposited into a savings account he'd opened himself the week after he turned 16. Dale remained Dale. At family gatherings, he talked about the firm. At holidays, he made pronouncements about Brendan's future as though the boy weren't seated 6 feet away. Brendan absorbed these pronouncements with a composure that I had watched him build, deliberately and incrementally, over years of practice. He nodded. He passed the rolls. He excused himself when the conversation turned in directions he didn't want to follow. He had learned, somewhere in the years between 6 and 16, how to be unreachable in a room full of people trying to reach him. Celeste, during these years, had developed a particular silence around Dale's assessments of their son. It was an agreement, I knew Celeste well enough by then to read the difference between her agreement silence and her choosing my battles silence. It was the latter. She had, I think, made a separate calculation that fighting Dale directly about Brendan produced less useful outcome than quietly finding ways around him. She bought Brendan books Dale would have dismissed. She drove him to competitions Dale didn't know about. She and I had an unspoken understanding that had never been named or formalized, but that functioned like a contract between two people who had both decided the same child was worth protecting. The spring that Brendan turned 17, he told me which university program he'd applied to. Early decision. Computer engineering with a concentration in distributed systems. The program ranked in the top 4 nationally. When I looked at the tuition, the number was significant, the kind of number that would have created a genuine obstacle if the fund hadn't been there, quietly compounding for 10 years by that point. "Have you told your parents?" I asked. He was at my kitchen table again. It had become his table, in some ways, the place he came to think out loud about things he couldn't think out loud about at home. "Mom knows," he said. "Dad thinks I'm applying to state. Does your mom know you told me?" A small, careful pause. "She knows I talked to you." I left it at that. He was accepted in December. Early decision, full read, the kind of letter that arrives by email now, but still feels the way paper letters used to feel, like something solid and irreversible. He called me before he called his mother, which told me everything I needed to know about who he thought his real audience was for that particular moment. I heard in his voice the specific quality of someone who has spent years moving toward something and has just confirmed it is real. "Congratulations," I said. And then, because he needed to hear it specifically, "Your father was wrong, Brendan. He has been wrong about you since you were 6 years old." A long pause. "You knew?" I was there. He was quiet for a while. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, flatter, more careful. "How long have you known I heard that?" "Since the morning it happened." Another silence. Then, "Okay," just that, "okay." The way you say okay when something you've carried for a long time is finally acknowledged by another person, and the acknowledgement is enough. "The fund is going to cover everything," I said. "All 4 years, dorms, books, everything. You don't have to take anything from your father." He didn't say anything for a moment. I heard him exhale. "Aunt Nora." "Don't thank me yet," I said. "Tell me what you're going to build." He told me. For 40 minutes, he told me about distributed systems and the specific architectural problem he wanted to work on, the one he'd been circling for 3 years, and I listened with the full attention of someone who understood exactly what he was describing and found it genuinely impressive. By the time he finished, I had made 2 mental notes and a decision. The decision was this: it was time to tell Celeste. Not everything, not the fund, not Leonard, not the full scope of what I'd built in parallel to the family's assumptions, but the part about the breakfast table. The part Celeste deserved to know 18 years after the fact, before her son walked into a new chapter of his life, still carrying the weight of a secret that had never been hers to carry. I called her the following Sunday morning, before Brendan had a chance to say anything to either of his parents. I asked if she had time to meet for coffee. She heard something in my voice. She always heard things in my voice, Celeste. She had an ear for what wasn't being said, and she met me at a coffee place near her office on Tuesday. I told her what I'd witnessed that January morning 18 years ago. Celeste held her coffee cup with both hands while I talked, and I watched her face move through something that wasn't any single emotion, but was several of them running in sequence too fast to name. When I finished, she was quiet for almost a full minute. Her hand went to the collar of her coat, adjusted it again. "He heard every word," she said finally, not a question, every word. She set the cup down with great deliberateness. "And you never told me." "I didn't think telling you would help Brendan," I said. "Not then. I thought it would put you in an impossible position." She looked at me for a long time. "And now Brendan's going to the best program in his field," I said, "on his own terms. I thought you deserved to know before he gets there." She looked back at her cup. Something in the set of her jaw had changed, a tightening, a new geometry to it. "Dale doesn't know he got in anywhere yet. No, this is going to go badly." "Yes," I said, "I know." She looked up at me. "What did you do, Nora? You did something. I can see it on you." I told her about the fund. Not every detail, not Leonard, not the specific balance, not the Charlotte property that had been quietly funding contributions for years. Just the core of it, that when Brendan was 7 years old, I had decided to make sure he had options, and I had been building those options ever since, and they were fully in place. Celeste Yun, who had a face that was usually composed with the particular control of someone who has spent 20 years in corporate law, pressed her lips together and looked somewhere past my left shoulder. She blinked 3 times fast. Then she put the back of her hand briefly against her mouth. "Okay," she said after a moment. "Okay. He's going to be fine," I said. "I know he's going to be fine." Her voice was steady but cost something to keep that way. "I've always known he was going to be fine. That is not the part I'm sitting with right now." I understood. I didn't push it. She drove home that Tuesday and told Dale that Brendan had been accepted to the program. I don't know exactly what happened in that house that evening, but Brendan called me from his car, parked in a gas station 2 blocks from home, and gave me a 1-minute summary in the measured tones of someone who has just survived something. Dale had not taken it well. There had been words. Brendan had left for the evening. "He said I went behind his back," Brendan said, "and that the program was impractical, and that I was throwing away a real future." I let the silence sit between us for a moment. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine." And he was, I could hear it, not performed fine, actual fine, the fine of someone who has already processed this outcome because they'd known it was coming for several years. "I'm just glad Mom knows." "What about the fund?" A pause. "Does he need to know?" "Not yet," I said. "Leonard will handle the disclosure when it's time. You don't owe your father an explanation of your financial resources." He was quiet. "You have a lawyer named Leonard?" "I have had a lawyer named Leonard for 6 years." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "How long have you been planning this?" "Brendan," I said. "I watched your father call you worthless when you were 6 years old. How long do you think?" "If you are still with me, stay, because what happened next is the reason I am telling you this story." What happened next was a company. Not immediately, not at 18, not in the way movies compress these things. It took time, the way real things take time. Brendan went to the program. He spent 4 years taking apart the problems he'd been circling since he was 11, building the understanding from the bottom up the way he'd always built things, finding the people who thought the way he thought. In his 2nd year, he met a graduate student named Amara Osai, no relation to Victor Huang's former partner, just a coincidence of common names, who had been working on the same architectural problem from a different angle. They started talking. Then they started working. Then, at some point in that working, something clicked into place that hadn't clicked before. I visited him twice during those 4 years. Once at the end of his 1st year, when he showed me what he was working on, and I came home and called Ingrid and told her to look at the emerging infrastructure market with fresh eyes. Once at the end of his 3rd year, when Amara was in the room and the 2 of them explained what they had built, and I sat in a university common room and understood that I was looking at something that was going to matter. Dale called me twice during those 4 years. Once to tell me that Brendan was being unrealistic and that he hoped I wasn't encouraging him. Once to ask, with the careful casualness of a man who needs information but won't admit why he needs it, whether I knew anything about Brendan's financial situation at school. "He seems fine," I said, which was true, and told him nothing. "He won't take my calls." I didn't respond to that. "Nora," a pause, "did you give him money?" "Dale," I said, "I love you, but that's between me and Brendan." He hung up without saying goodbye, which was its own kind of answer. The company launched in the spring of the year Brendan was 24. It was called Lattice Systems, and it solved a problem in distributed network architecture that had been expensive and inelegant for years. And within 18 months, it had a client list that included 3 mid-sized financial institutions and a logistics network, not Dale's. A different one, though the irony was not lost on me, an evaluation that had been quietly, then loudly, attracting attention from the investment community. Raj Pillai, Dale's financial consultant, the one who had restructured the firm a decade earlier, called me that winter. I had not spoken to him in years. He had apparently been following Lattice Systems in the trade press, had made the connection, and was calling to tell me, in the careful language of a man trying to extract information without seeming to extract it, that he thought there was an opportunity worth discussing. "Does Dale know?" I asked, a pause. "That it's Brendan's company? No. Keep it that way for now." "Nora, Raj," my voice was pleasant and final. "Keep it that way." I called Leonard that afternoon. We had spoken quarterly for 6 years, the way you speak with professionals who are managing something long-term and methodical, and he knew without extensive explanation what the shift in timeline meant. "The IPO filing is going to surface everything," he said. "Once it's public, the fund's history is public record. Dale will see it." "I know." And Celeste? Celeste has known for years. Then you're prepared. I have been prepared, I said, for approximately 18 years, Leonard. He made the same sound Ingrid sometimes made, the sound of someone who respects a long preparation. I'll make sure the documentation is current. You'll want everything in order before the announcement. I already want everything in order, I said. That's why I called you 6 years ago. The IPO announcement was scheduled for a Thursday morning in November. The venue was a conference center in Charlotte. Lattice's headquarters was there, 40 minutes from Raleigh, 40 minutes from my house on the lake, in the city where I had driven 22 years old and mapped a 5-year plan on my laptop in an empty apartment. I thought about that sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. Dale received an invitation. Brendan had sent it himself, I know because Brendan told me, and because of the care with which he'd worded it. Not a reconciliation. Not an olive branch, exactly. A witness summons of a kind. He wanted his father in the room. He had wanted that for reasons that were his own and that I respected without fully understanding, the way you respect a decision made from a place of complicated love. Celeste came to my house the evening before. She sat at my kitchen table, Brendan's table, the family table, the table that had hosted more important conversations than my dining room ever had, and drank tea and didn't say much, and I sat across from her and did the same. He called me last week, she said eventually. Dale? Brendan. She turned the mug in her hands. He asked me if I was okay with what was going to happen tomorrow. I waited. I told him that whatever happened was between him and his father, and that I had been okay for a long time, and that I was proud of him. She looked up at me. He cried a little. He tries not to, but he does. I looked at the table. He's allowed to. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. What exactly is going to happen tomorrow? The announcement, the stock price, the news anchor. I met her eyes. And then Dale is going to understand in public in front of cameras what he said at that breakfast table and what it cost him. She held my gaze. He's going to be humiliated. Yes. Is that, she stopped, started again. Is that what Brendan wants? Brendan wants his father to see him, I said. What his father does with that is up to his father. She absorbed this. Turned the mug one more time. Okay, she said softly. Okay. The morning of the announcement arrived the way consequential mornings do, ordinary, slightly overcast, requiring coffee. I drove to Charlotte alone. I wore a blazer I'd bought 2 years earlier for a client presentation, the kind of thing you put on when you want to feel like the version of yourself you've been building toward. I parked in the conference center garage and sat in the car for 2 minutes, not from nerves but from something harder to name, a kind of recognition that a very long preparation was about to conclude, and that there is something solemn about endings even when they are the endings you wanted. The lobby was already filling when I went inside. Investors. Press. A camera crew from a regional business news outlet that had been following the Lattice story since the valuation crossed into 9 figures. I found Celeste near the back of the room, wearing a dark blazer of her own, her posture the particular posture of a woman who is holding herself together by quality of training alone. And I found Dale. He was standing near the front, slightly to the left of center, with Raj Pillai beside him. I had not seen my brother in 8 months. We had been in the same city the entire time and had spoken on the phone twice, and neither conversation had contained anything real. He looked older than I expected. Not diminished, Dale had never been diminished by time, he was too solid for that, but reconfigured, the way a person looks when the certainty they've built their face around has been quietly eroding for a while. He saw me across the room. A moment of recalibration, a quick inward adjustment, the kind that happens before the face catches up. Then a nod, professional, contained, the nod of a man who is not sure what today is yet. I nodded back. I moved to stand near Celeste. He didn't ask me why I was here, she said quietly. Did you explain? No. The lights at the front of the room shifted. People began to settle. A moderator from the investment firm took the podium briefly, overview of the company, the filing, the context. Technical and financial language that washed over the room in the pleasant, incomprehensible way of prepared remarks. And then Amara came out first, to warm applause, composed and precise, with the kind of presence that belongs to someone who has been in rooms like this before and found them manageable. And then Brendan walked onto the stage. He was 26 years old. He was wearing a dark jacket and a slight, focused expression that belonged entirely to himself, not performed, not defensive, not performing confidence he didn't have. Just present. Specific. the particular quality of a person who has been building something for years and has arrived at the moment of showing it without apology. The applause was genuine and substantial. From the front of the room, I watched Dale's face. The news anchor, a woman named Denise Kwon from the regional outlet, leaned toward her microphone with the forward energy of someone who has prepared good questions and is genuinely interested in the answers. "Tell us about your journey," she said. "From the beginning. How do you describe where you came from to where you're standing right now?" Brendan looked out at the room for a moment. His eyes moved across the investors, across the press, across the faces he knew and didn't know. They landed briefly on mine, then on his mother's, then on his father's. Dale's expression had passed through several phases in the 30 seconds since Brendan walked on stage. The initial incomprehension, the loading moment of a man whose mental model is encountering contradictory data. Then something more complex, a recounting, visible in real time, of every assessment he had ever made and every way those assessments now stood against this room, this stage, these cameras, this applause. His hand had gone into his jacket pocket. He pulled it halfway out, then pushed it back in. Raj leaned slightly toward Dale and said something quiet. Dale didn't respond. Brendan said, into the microphone, in the calm and measured voice of someone who has been thinking about this answer for a long time, "I come from a family that had strong opinions about what I was capable of, and I spent a long time, most of my life, honestly, letting those opinions exist without arguing with them. I just kept building things. I figured the work would be the argument." The room absorbed this. Dale's hand came back out of his pocket. He was holding his phone. He looked at it without seeing it, then put it back. That was the moment I understood that today was not going to be clean. It was not going to be clean because nothing real ever is. It was going to be whatever it was going to be, which was complicated and human and irreversible, and I had done everything I could to make sure the irreversible parts landed on solid ground. The presentation continued for 45 minutes. By the time it was over, the numbers on the screen showed a company valued at something that would have been incomprehensible to a 6-year-old in dinosaur pajamas, and completely comprehensible to the 26-year-old standing at the podium, because he had built it and he understood every moving part of it at the molecular level. The news anchor wrapped her coverage with a line about the stock price, how it had responded to the announcement, the trajectory, the market's read on the company's future. The number she cited was large and specific and public. In the back of the room, Dale had gone very still. Not the stillness of composure. The stillness of a man who has run out of the particular motion that confidence requires and has not yet found the next thing to do with his hands. If you are wondering whether Dale understood in that moment the full weight of what he had said at that breakfast table, I believe he did. I cannot prove it. But I watched his face move through something in those final minutes of the presentation that had nothing to do with investment returns or market valuation. I watched him look at his son on a stage in front of cameras and investors and a news anchor, and I watched him perform a private arithmetic that had nothing to do with numbers. After the formal presentation concluded and the room shifted into the cocktail and networking phase, I stayed near the back with Celeste. Brendan made his rounds, investors, press, colleagues, with Amara beside him, fluent and at ease in the way of someone who has been practicing for exactly this. He was good at it, better than I would have been at his age. Dale did not move from his position near the front for a long time. Raj said something to him, and Dale gave a single syllable in response, and then Raj, with the professional sensitivity of a man who reads rooms for a living, made a quiet excuse and stepped away. And then Celeste did something I had not anticipated. She walked across the room toward Dale. I watched from where I stood. I could not hear them. I watched Celeste reach her husband and stand beside him in the way she'd stood beside him for decades, not facing him but parallel to him, both of them looking at the same stage. I watched her say something. I watched Dale's chest rise and fall. I watched him turn his head and look at her, and I watched her look back with the expression of a woman who has 25 years of marriage and an immovable love for her child and a reckoning she has been quietly carrying, and is choosing now to put it down. I don't know what she said. I will not invent it. Whatever it was between them, and it belonged to them. What I can tell you is that Dale found me before I left the room. I was near the exit, putting on my coat, and I heard him behind me and turned. He looked like a man who has just been handed the complete version of a story he thought he already knew, and who is still processing the gap between the two versions. He looked, for the first time in my memory, uncertain in a way that had nothing to do with information. He was uncertain about himself, about his own sight, about what he had been looking at for 18 years when he looked at his son and seen nothing worth seeing. "You knew," he said, not accusatory. Flat. Factual. "I knew he was at that doorway," I said. "Yes." He held my gaze for a moment. His jaw worked briefly, like he was testing words that weren't ready. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you wouldn't have believed me," I said, "and because Brendan didn't need you to stop. He needed you to not stop him." Dale looked away. He looked toward the stage, where his son was still talking to a journalist with the ease of someone who has found the frequency that suits him. A long breath went out of Dale, not dramatic, not a collapse, just the actual release of something that had been held incorrectly for a very long time. "The fund," he said. "Celeste told me about the fund." "Yes." "How long?" 10 years. He was quiet. I watched something move across his face that I had not expected to see there, something that might, in a different man, have been called shame. On Dale, it looked more like a horizontal reorientation. A compass needle finding a different north than the one it had been pointing at for decades. "Nora," his voice was careful. He's remarkable." "Yes," I said, "he has always been remarkable. You had 10 years of Sundays to see it." He didn't flinch from that. I gave him credit for it. He absorbed it the way you absorb something that is accurate and cannot be argued with. "I know," he said. And then, quietly, in the voice of a man speaking to himself as much as to me, "I know." I zipped my coat. I picked up my bag. "Go talk to your son, Dale, not about the company. Not about what this means for the firm or for you. Just go talk to him." He looked at me for one more moment. Then he nodded, once, with a seriousness I had not seen on him in a very long time, and he turned back toward the room. I left the conference center and drove home along the lake road with the windows cracked despite the November cold, because I needed the air and the particular clarity that comes from the end of something long. The company had gone public. The stock price had done what it did. The news anchor had asked her question and gotten an answer that would clip well for years. And somewhere in a conference center in Charlotte, a 26-year-old man who had been told at 6 that he was worthless was talking to his father, on his own terms, on the day of his choosing, in a room full of evidence. In the weeks that followed, the things that needed to happen happened in the order they needed to happen. Leonard filed the final documentation that formalized the transfer of trustee responsibilities to Brendan. He was long past the age where I held any administrative role over the account, had been for years. But the paperwork closed the loop in the way that Leonard believed paperwork should close loops, which is to say cleanly and completely. Ingrid sent me a final statement of the fund's history, annotated with dates and contributions and returns, which I kept because it was the closest thing I have to a record of the decision I made in a fraction of a second when I caught the eye of a 6-year-old in a doorway. Dale and Celeste are still married. I want to be honest about what that means and what it doesn't mean. Dale is not a changed man in the way that stories sometimes require people to be changed, wholesale, dramatic, declared. He is a changed man in the quieter, more durable way, which is that he knows something now he did not know before, and the knowing has altered the geometry of how he moves through certain rooms. He and Brendan have spoken, more than once. I was not present for any of those conversations, and I did not ask for a report. That relationship is theirs to rebuild or not rebuild on their own terms and their own timeline. Raj Pillai, for what it's worth, called Dale the Monday after the IPO and offered to restructure his engagement with the firm. Dale declined. He told my mother, who told me, that he was making some changes to how he ran things. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't push. That is, honestly, probably the right architecture for that conversation. Lattice Systems is still growing. I follow it the way you follow something you were early to, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who recognized the shape of a thing before the market did. Amara and Brendan are both on the short list for a trade award I will not name here because naming it would sound like gloating, and I am trying not to gloat. I am trying only to tell you what happened. My practice is 42 years old, and I am 41, which is one of those numerical coincidences that means nothing except that I started early and kept going. Ingrid is still my forensic accountant. Leonard still has the corner office on Tryon Street. The Charlotte property has appreciated by something I will describe as significantly and leave at that. I am not telling you this to perform success. I am telling you this because you should know that the woman who stood in that family's kitchen gathering warmth against the cold of being unseen, she did not stay cold. Brendan called me the Sunday after the IPO. He was at his apartment in Charlotte, and he said he wanted me to know that whatever happened next with his father, whatever got rebuilt or didn't, he needed me to understand something first. I knew you were there, he said. That morning, I was 6, but I knew you saw me. And I knew you weren't going to pretend you hadn't. A pause, that mattered. That is the thing that mattered most. I did not say anything for a moment. I was standing in my kitchen with the coffee I'd made and the lake out the window and 24 years of a decision that had started in a fraction of a second and built into this. I know, I said finally. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me, I said. You built it. He laughed, a real laugh, the easy laugh of someone whose chest has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just set it down for good. Okay, he said, we both built it. I thought about that for a while after we hung up. I thought about the two versions of building. The building you do in accounts and legal documents and quiet phone calls to attorneys on Tryon Street, and the building you do in university common rooms at 2 in the morning when you are 22 years old and you have a problem nobody has solved yet, and you believe, with the specific conviction of someone who has always been told he lacks conviction, that you are the one to solve it. Both kinds of building are real. Both kinds take time. And both kinds, in the end, rest on the same foundation. The belief, held privately and nurtured deliberately, that what someone says about you at a breakfast table does not get to be the final word. So here is what I want to know from you. Because I have been called a lot of things since that day in Charlotte, some people in my family think I overstepped, think the fund was interference, think I should have stayed out of it entirely. Others think I didn't go far enough, that Dale should have faced more, should have known sooner, should have been confronted years before the IPO room made the confrontation unavoidable. I made the choices I made. Brendan is 26, running a public company, and called me on a Sunday to say thank you. That is the outcome. So you tell me, did I go too far, or not far enough? I genuinely want to know what you think.